afternoon, ladies and gentlemen.
Good afternoon.
I trust that you had a very good lunch, and we are now in a position where we can start the post-lunch session, which is really, it says a stakeholder consultation, but I think we may need to also place it within the context of an awareness building session on what is called the proposed treaty on the protection of persons in the event of disasters. It is very new to us here in Barbados, and I would even extend that to the region. It is part of a global initiative that is being led by the UN, and it speaks to just what it says, the protection of persons in the event of disasters. Now, the rationale, the overall rationale for this session is really to gather perspectives, and I know your note says from a Barbadian perspective, but I know we have our regional partners, and this session is also for you, so you can get a handle on this new proposed treaty. Now, the protection of persons in disasters is being codified through an upcoming legally binding UN treaty. And it emphasizes human rights, disaster risk reduction, and coordinated international assistance. And today, the purpose of this session is to sensitize key stakeholders on the treaty process, the key issues affecting Barbados and the region, and how the treaty can contribute to enhancing community resilience. A second goal of today's session is about building regional and national momentum and interest, and I dare say awareness, in issues concerning the protection of persons in the event of disasters, and the importance of having an internationally binding instrument and what that means to each and every one of us. And a final goal of today's session is gathering a wide range of perspectives on key issues outlined in the draft articles, and identifying ways of strengthening the relevance and impact of the treaty for the region. It is really a pleasure as the Director of Department of Emergency Management to be a part of this discussion today. And I will hand over to Ms. Jessie Jordan. She will be the facilitator for the session. Jessie is I would say, the disaster law expert from the International Federation of the Red Cross. And she is very intimate to this process. And she will guide us today through our proceedings. And I will give her the floor so she can introduce the other guests.
Thank you so very much, Ms. Hines, and I want to especially thank her for giving IFRC this space. Also, thank the Barbados Red Cross, Miss Alexander, who is on the panel with us. And, I would have met Ms. Hines a few months ago where we had a similar meeting in Jamaica. And she was, both Barbados Red Cross and DEM were very interested in this process, along with the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. So through that meeting in Jamaica, here we are, a few months later, conducting this session. So a big thank you to Ms. Hines for that. So I wanted to start by just letting you know that there is going to be a registration sheet passed around. This is specific to this session, this consultation. So if you would indulge me to do that, there will be one sheet per table. We have some other copies coming around, so please indulge me. There's also going to be the treaty document, which is well, it's not the treaty yet. It's a bit of a long way from there, but what we do have right now are the draft articles, which the treaty is starting point. So that's going to be handed out. There are not copies for individual copies. There are copies that could be spread across each table, and we will have a QR code that you can also use to download the document when we reach to that portion of the session. So while my colleague from Barbados Red Cross, Daniel, is passing out the documents, because this is the afternoon and I have the pleasure of, standing in front of you while you've just had a very nice, delicious meal, just to, get your muscles a little bit relaxed and your jaw a little bit relaxed. Before we start the session and get your mind going, I know there's an important, very important thing happening at 3 p.m. today, for those of you who know what I'm talking about. Yes. England versus Argentina at 3 p.m. So how many of you are supporting England by raise of hands? Oh, a few. How many of you are supporting Argentina? Oh. All right. How many of you were supporting France? Maybe third round, maybe third place winners, hopefully. And Spain. Okay. I hear somebody on this side that isn't supporting anyone. All right. So now that we have that out of the way, I'm very pleased to present to you the esteemed panelists that are on the table, and we also have some panelists connected via the Zoom link. So I will start to my left, which is the Most Honorable Ms. Kerry-Ann Eiffel, who is the National Human Rights Commissioner. We also have Ms. Fabiana Alexander, who is the President of the Barbados Red Cross Society. Next to her is Ms. Joanna Ben Griffith from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. And of course, we just heard from Ms. Kerry Hines, who is the Director of the DEM. So I just wanted to give you a brief intro into who will be speaking with us, and we also have our colleagues from the Barbados Permanent Mission who are connected online, and we will introduce them when the session, as we start the session. So I believe we should have Mr. Nicholas Cox, who is the Deputy Permanent Representative for the Permanent Mission for Barbados to the United Nations, and Ms. Dina Hines, who is an AOSIS Fellow. So I think now is the time that we will pass it over to the Barbados Permanent Mission, who will give us just a brief overview of what is this document, or what is this process that is being engaged at the UN level, what is this PPED treaty, and perhaps, give us some brief remarks on what this process involves from their perspective. So over to the representatives from the mission. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Ms. Jordan. Good afternoon to everyone. The Most Honorable Ms. Carrie-Ann Eiffel, National Human Rights Commissioner, Ms. Carrie Hines, Director, Department of Emergency Management, Ms. Fabiana Alexander, President of the Barbados Red Cross Society, to all stakeholders, colleagues, and participants, good afternoon from a very hot and muggy New York City. We are happy to join you this afternoon. Sorry we can't be there with you in person. I heard reference to a delicious lunch, which we did not have the opportunity to partake with you. With me is my colleague Dina Hines, who is the Italy AOSIS Fellow for 2026, assigned to the Permanent Mission of Barbados to the United Nations. As noted, my name is Nicholas Cox. I'm the Deputy Permanent Representative here at the Permanent Mission. We are once again happy to be with you. We are very happy that you have convened this very useful briefing, which will give a bit of insight into the work that we are undertaking here at the United Nations, and now in terms of this process, which we are very happy to have your support. Just by way of a bit of an overview, the PPED process is taking place within the 6th Committee of the United Nations, which deals with legal matters. This process is but one of very many that are being considered by the 6th Committee. In addition to the PPED, currently major issues for which intergovernmental treaty arrangements are being established are also include crimes against humanity and the agreement on the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea and the conservation and sustainable use of marine biological diversity on areas beyond national jurisdiction. A mouthful, we call it the BBNJ agreement and the High Seas agreement. I say that to say that this mission, as currently configured, is not fully up to its capacity in terms of manpower. So the coverage of issues in the 6th Committee is one that we have to prioritize based on the very important national interests. So for the PPED process, while fully realizing the importance for Barbados and the region, this process has been led in New York by Jamaica and a core group of countries, which also includes the Bahamas. How we operate in New York is that we practice burden sharing. So because we are all CARICOM countries with small delegations. So with Jamaica and the Bahamas actively involved, we tend to be briefed on this process at the CARICOM Caucus of Ambassadors. They bring us out, the Jamaica and the Bahamas ask for support at critical issues, critical junctures in the negotiating process, which we have done in the past to lend and show that there's considerable support for PPED from CARICOM small island developing states. Barbados itself has not been actively involved in the process for the reasons I've already mentioned, but we do keep a watching brief of this issue. Since Ms. Hines has been with us since February, we have asked her to follow the process to the best of her ability while addressing all the other multiple competing demands that she has to tend to. So we can provide an overview, and Ms. Hines will follow on from me and provide a brief overview of the state of affairs. But I just wanted to say just generally that we are very, very happy at the interest in this process from Capital. It's quite important, and we look forward to your continued engagement. And as I said, we'll continue to lend as much support. There's some important critical meetings coming up in the near future, and we highly recommend that Barbados continues to show an interest in these, and I very much hope that we can see the participation of a delegation from Capital in these processes, which Dina will go into. Just quickly on some of the geopolitical issues involved, I would have mentioned that there are other treaties under negotiation, one of which is, as I said, crimes against humanity. And just to note that in the intergovernmental environment, in the multilateral environment that we are currently witnessing, it's become increasingly difficult to reach agreement between the 193 countries of the United Nations on how we go forward on certain issues, certainly related to PP&ED in the Sixth Committee in 2024, when the decision was taken to take the draft articles and have them be transformed into a treaty. This decision was a very contentious one in the Sixth Committee. The Sixth Committee usually makes its decisions by consensus. Many other committees in the UN quite often vote to reach agreement. Sixth Committee practices consensus, and I'm saying this all to note that in December 2024, the adoption of this decision very nearly brought the Sixth Committee to a vote. And it was only at the very last minute that parties agreed to move forward without voting. Since then, we've seen the preparatory process continue, and we will be going towards a process where these geopolitical issues will become important. That's it for me right now. I'm going to pass it over to Ms. Hines, and then we'll be happy to hear back from you. Thank you.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. I am just here to say a few words. There are two important dates coming up when it comes to this treaty that is being negotiated. So the first one will be the preparatory commission. So basically, at this event, what is going to happen is that the rules and the procedures determining how the treaty would be negotiated would be decided. So that is happening from August 31st to September 4th here in New York at UN headquarters. So that is an important event that influences a lot of what happens at the other event that I will mention, which is happening in 2027. So this treaty, as Ms. Jordan had said, what you currently have access to are draft articles. Now, these form the foundation of what will be incorporated into the treaty, but since then, countries have given their recommendations, their textual proposals, any words they may want to add, any paragraphs they may want to add to this base foundation that was provided by the International Law Commission. So as of right now, Barbados has not yet provided its textual proposals. The deadline for textual proposals to have gone in a compilation document has passed. However, that does not mean that we cannot still come up with recommendations and decide on any additional text language that we might want to see added to the document. So there's still time for that. And all of this information, the textual proposals from different countries and member states, all of this goes into forming the foundational document that will be used to start negotiating the treaty formally in January into February of 2027. I think the official dates are January 25th, as of right now, into mid-February, 3 weeks. The location of the negotiations is to be determined because there have been some issues with the original host country, but those should soon be finalized and that information will be available. Because of the importance of this treaty to the region, to us as a country, it is important that hopefully there are representatives from Barbados who are able to assist with the preparatory commission and also the negotiation in 2027. So any questions that the audience may have regarding the PPED and the process here in New York, I would be happy to answer. But until that time, I will hand it back over to you.
If I may come in just quickly to say that the PrepCom this summer is going to be organizational in nature to prepare for the conference of plenipotentiaries that Ms. Hines mentioned. Amongst the issues they're going to consider will be the rules of procedure and the dates and location of the conference of plenipotentiaries. Ms. Hines just referenced the arrangements for January into February, and we would just note that Philippines, the original host that was expected for the conference in next year, has indicated their inability to host. So right now, the efforts are underway to try to determine another country that will host. We are hearing some rumblings of a potential name. It's very much hoped that it will be a country from the global south, given the very important nature of this process to the global south. And there might be some change in the dates based on this and the need for another country to come forward. So thank you. That's it from us here at the Permanent Mission, and we're available to you.
Thank you so much, Mr. Cox, Deputy Permanent Representative, and also Ms. Hines from the Barbados Permanent Mission to the UN. So I'll give you the opportunity, for those of you who don't have an actual copy of the draft articles in front of you, the scan is on, the QR code is on the screen. If you would like to scan the document to have it, in front of you. But what is this, protection of persons in event of disasters, PPED treaty, really all about? And so, as was mentioned by the Barbados Permanent Mission, it is a proposed international legally binding instrument, and this was a decision by the UN General Assembly to elaborate and conclude this instrument by the end of 2027. And why are we talking about this? What's the rationale behind having this instrument? And one of the main reasons, I would say, is that the current state of international law, as it stands now, is really fragmented on this topic. You have different international instruments. You have the Paris Agreement on one side. You have Sendai Framework. You also have different human rights conventions. You have what they call the Tampere Convention, which deals with communication. So there are a lot of different topics that are scattered in different instruments. And so the aim of this, I would say, new proposed treaty is to combine, on the one hand, disaster risk reduction obligations with the duty to protect persons in disasters. And I say disaster risk reduction obligations, although we do have already a very important instrument called the Sendai Framework, which many of you might be familiar with. This instrument, the Sendai Framework, is not a binding instrument. So the difference is with this one is that we want countries really to commit, not just to volunteer their commitment. So what does this really mean for community resilience? This definitely has implications on community resilience, and that's why we're here today, right? What happens at the international level always filters down regionally and locally, and it means, therefore, that if this instrument is adopted at the international level, there could be potential for investment at the local level, but it also means perhaps new obligations, or maybe not new obligations, but obligations that we have to enforce as countries. So it's extremely important that we, as in the Caribbean, understand what this process is about, because at the end of the day, we don't want, you know, the countries that have, I would say, the largest muscle in terms of population size and political muscle to determine what happens with us, right? So in terms of the instrument that hopefully you would have downloaded via your phone, the draft articles, as mentioned by the permanent mission a few minutes ago, it was an instrument that was developed by the International Law Commission back in 2016, and this is what will form the basis of the discussions that we would be having now. And since then, there have been many states that have proposed amendments to these articles, and we will go through what this instrument is all about, and hopefully by the end of it, you will have a greater understanding, of course, but also reflect on what does this mean for Barbados, what does this mean for our region. So the way the instrument is set out, as you will see on the screen, it starts with, you know, the usual types of articles, which I would say would be the foundation of this instrument. So it starts off with a preamble, it sets out the scope, the purpose, and definitions. So that would be the first block, I would say, Articles 1 to 3. Then you have a second block, which deals with human dignity, human rights, humanitarian principles. So that would constitute Articles 4 to 6. And the third block, now we're starting to get more into the meat of what this instrument is about. So it speaks to roles and responsibilities, specifically the roles and responsibilities of state actors. So there is a duty to cooperate. What are the forms of cooperation? Not just a duty, but what types of cooperation are we talking about? Also, rules and responsibilities with respect to disaster risk reduction. As I mentioned before, this treaty aims to combine disaster risk reduction obligations with the protection of persons. And also, what is the role of the affected state? You know, we always talk about the affected state needs to have a primary role. What does that look like? So in the fourth big block of the document, we have what I refer to broadly as external assistance. That takes up a chunk of articles, so moving from Article 11 to 17. So you're talking about, you know, the duty to seek external assistance, offers, consent, what should be the conditions in which external assistance should be provided, the facilitation, protection of relief, relief meaning protection of relief personnel, equipment, and so on, and termination of that relief. Then moving to, you know, the last article of the treaty, actually, of the proposed treaty, is the relationship to other rules of international law. So it talks about actually specifically international humanitarian law. How does that relate to those other legal frameworks? And then finally, I put a last block there with a question mark on governance. Presently, the draft articles say nothing about governance. So there is a missing piece from, you know, IFRC's perspective. There's a missing piece there that needs to be filled, and you will see that as we go along, and you may have your own views on what that should look like. So I'll say a little bit more about each block as we go through, so you have a better understanding of the content, what this really is all about. So the first thing is that it covers all persons, regardless of nationality or legal status. And this means that if a disaster happens in your country, protection shouldn't cover just the citizens. You know, protection needs to cover everyone who's there, whether they be an undocumented migrant, you know, somebody who's just a resident, and so on. Also, it includes state-to-state obligations and state obligations to disaster-affected persons. What does that mean? It means that it looks at relationships on two levels: a horizontal level, so state obligations to disaster-affected persons, as well as a horizontal level. Did I say vertical? Vertical and horizontal. Yes, I'm getting confused with my axes. And then it aims to balance needs-based and rights-based approaches. What does this mean? Essential needs must be met with the full respect for rights. And an example is if I'm providing humanitarian assistance and the assistance, let's say, is in relation to the area of shelter, it must be, it shouldn't be that I provide a shelter that is of low quality. It has to be of a standard that reflects the respect for human rights and human dignity. Another very key element of this, this instrument is the definition of disaster. And so I believe that at the treaty negotiation level, this is going to be a hot topic. How should disaster be defined? In the articles that you have in front of you, it speaks to a calamitous event, which I would say is a very high threshold. Should this be the threshold? It's yet to be determined. It also speaks to an event or series of events, which means to cover perhaps small-scale disasters and arguably maybe opens the door to slow onset disasters. Perhaps one way to strengthen may be that we have to specifically mention slow onset within the definition, but that's also up for debate. It also excludes armed conflict, and there's a specific reason for this, because armed conflict fits within the realm of other international laws. So in terms of the second block, we're talking about rights, dignity, and humanitarian principles. We're talking about human dignity, which of course is a foundational principle, and states have a duty to respect and protect through all phases of the disaster management cycle. In terms of human rights, some of you who may be familiar with human rights conventions, there is already this obligation that exists within international law. So this is not the creation of new obligations, specifically humanity, neutrality, impartiality, and non-discrimination, which for us in the Red Cross movement, we consider extremely fundamental when we are talking about protecting the rights of persons in disasters and, of course, groups that are more vulnerable. In terms of the next block of roles and responsibilities, this is where it starts to get a little bit, more substantive in terms of this subject matter. But when we talk about the duty to cooperate and the duty to reduce the risk of disasters, these are not new obligations. These are obligations that already exist in international law, and the idea is that we don't want piecemeal obligations scattered everywhere. We want to codify it in this instrument. And so you would see that these principles exist already in the UN Charter, the Sendai Framework, and even at the regional level. We had SEDIMA, Ms. Riley from SEDIMA speaking this morning, talking specifically about comprehensive disaster management, and indeed, disaster risk reduction is a core element of comprehensive disaster management. And so when we look at these obligations of cooperation and reducing risk of disasters, we're not looking at it from the point of view of diminishing the primary role of the state, but it is complementary to the role of the state. In terms of cooperation, we're looking not just cooperation among states, but specifically intergovernmental and non-governmental. I referenced CEDIMA. CEDIMA is an intergovernmental organization, but we also have many non-governmental organizations represented here among you. And so you already know how critical non-governmental organizations are to the disaster management process. And in terms of this block of articles, you will see as well the Red Cross, Red Crescent movement was highlighted as one of the key entities with respect to cooperation and so on. And these draft articles specifically highlight the Red Cross, Red Crescent movement. One, historically, the Red Cross has been there before, during, and after disasters, but also because of its presence. In 191 countries, the Red Cross is present, so it aligns to a very integrated sort of entity within this space, and so it was mentioned there. The duty of the state to ensure protection of persons in disasters also stems from this principle of sovereignty. You know, you hear a lot about, you know, the state being sovereign in this regard, and also role versus responsibility. I would say role, when we talk about primary role of the state, we also use that term rather than responsibility, where, you know, responsibility has more of a deeper obligation, and with role, it's interpreted more with a little bit more flexibility. In terms of external assistance, now this is a huge block of the draft articles, and you will see many topics covered there. In the interest of time, I'll just go through them a bit more quickly, but in terms of, you know, it speaks to the duty to seek assistance, you know, and this is in relation to where capacity is manifestly exceeded. And we experience that in the Caribbean all the time. We've mentioned over and over again this morning, you know, Melissa, Beryl, Dorian, all of the La Soufrière eruption, all of these disasters required external help. This block also speaks to offers, you know, offers being voluntary, not a legal duty for countries to assist. A very important concept is also the concept of consent. So there must be consent. State must have direction and control of what is happening within their territory. What are the conditions to assistance? Should there be a right to condition assistance and maybe deny unwanted or unneeded assistance? We hear horror stories all the time of things being sent that aren't needed. Mr. James from Antigua and Barbuda will tell you a lot about that. But facilitation as well. What kinds of facilitation do we need to allow for humanitarian actors to operate? You know, states, the instrument encourages states to allow for temporary non-applicability of laws. For instance, you know, customs and tax duty waivers and so on. You have seen that a lot in various major disasters. And then termination. Termination, it recognizes the right of any party to terminate assistance with consultation. Of course, these decisions must consider the needs of affected persons. And then the last article of the instrument speaks to relationship to other rules of international law. As I mentioned, it expressly recognizes international humanitarian law in relation to situations of armed conflict. But the idea is that this instrument is not meant to prejudice the other existing conventions or treaties in relation to other related topics, like refugees and migration, maritime, and so on. It's meant to preserve their application and, of course, maintain coherence. And then finally, as I said initially, there's this idea of governance that currently doesn't exist in the treaty at this moment. And when we say governance, what are we really talking about? So we're talking about the decision-making processes. How does that happen? You know, what would be the administrative support for the implementation of this treaty? How are we going to monitor that states are complying? What would be the financial arrangements, procedures, and so on? Based on the dialogues we've had with states across the region and others, we've noted that states don't want to be burdened even more than they're already burdened. There are so many treaties, there are so many processes. As the permanent mission said, you know, we have limited capacity and there are many things happening at the same time. So the idea is that if there is a governance structure, it should be something light and flexible, you know, avoids excessive bureaucracy, but there is a definite need for a follow-up mechanism and an advisory body, because we go through all this trouble of having a nice instrument, a nice legal framework, but then nobody implements it, nobody is monitoring who is doing what. So there is a need for that definitely in the treaty. And this is one of IFRC's core proposals or recommendations, is that within the framework of this instrument that we establish a monitoring and implementation mechanism. And at IFRC, we have offered ourselves, I would say, as willing to serve as a technical or advisory subsidiary body, given the experience and expertise that we do have in this area. So in addition to that, I will just mention really quickly some key recommendations and proposals that we think could possibly strengthen the draft articles, you know, some key themes that we outlined. The first area, of course, being the protection of people affected by disasters. This is a core element of the treaty, and as it's in the name, actually. But there are ways that we could really make this a little bit more robust. And one of the ways is including a right to receive humanitarian assistance. Should this be a right? Maybe we can argue that during the panel. And in the, you know, when we ask for your feedback. Also, we recommend, you know, having a list of inexhaustible measures on ways we can protect persons. We don't want to let it just go unsaid. In terms of disaster risk reduction, as I mentioned, you know, the Sendai framework is there, yes, but we need to create this binding duty, and it can be done within this instrument. Facilitation of external assistance, the idea is that we should include conditions related to quality and appropriateness. We don't want to have, you know, winter clothes being sent to a Caribbean country in a disaster, which has happened before. You know, we want to include also this idea of anticipatory action and early recovery interventions. We've heard in the session just before a lot about anticipatory action, so we want to be able to speak to that. And then, very importantly for this audience, I would say, is the role of other assisting actors. The idea is that it's not just what's happening internationally, but what's happening locally. We need to make sure that there is priority on the local actors on the ground, that you are there when the disaster happens, before it happens, during and after. And so it's really key to ensure that you are also empowered within international instruments and also the regional and national instruments. It mentions there, again, you know, the Red Cross actors, but Red Cross, of course, is not the only actor on the ground. So I've said quite a lot, and I want to give opportunity for, you know, the panelists to share, and also, as well, to hear from you. And so I'd like to invite, our panelists who you would see on the screen now, and I've already introduced them. So I won't reintroduce them, but we can start with Ms. Hines. And from the Department of Emergency Management perspective, how should disaster be defined in the treaty, and what roles and duties should the state have?
Thank you, Ms. Jordan. Thank you so very much for the question and for the overview of the draft articles and the whole treaty process. Now, as persons will know, we have a very pervasive disaster risk management program. It is situated in our Emergency Management Act, 2007, and we also have a mandated program. The Department of Emergency Management, we are the government entity mandated to ensure that there is an active disaster risk management program. We coordinate the program, and we seek to coordinate the various actors at the national level, and this would include the community organizations, the various agencies of government, the various private sector, non-governmental agencies here in Barbados. And of course, connected to that, we are a part of the SEDEMA mechanism, which looks at the regional scope of disaster risk management. And within our space, not only the national space, but the regional space, we have adopted the Comprehensive Disaster Risk Management Strategy and Framework, which seeks to define disaster risk management. It seeks to define the actors within the national and regional space. It seeks to define the various phases. So we're not just speaking to preparedness and response, but when we speak about disaster risk management, we speak about preparedness, mitigation, response, recovery, before, during, and after. And this is not something that is linear. It is a continuous process. Now, when we look maybe at the textbook definition of disaster, and within the Sendai framework, which, in addition to Barbados, a number of other states within the region, we voluntarily adopted. A disaster is defined as a serious disruption of the functioning of a community or society at any scale due to hazardous events interacting with conditions of exposure, vulnerability, and capacity, leading to one or more of the following: human, material, economic, and environmental losses and impacts. That is a mouthful, but it speaks to the whole issue of the multi-hazard environment as well, and the impact of the various hazards on our society and our communities. Disasters occur when they exceed our ability to respond. And within the context of the treaty, I think it is very important that we acknowledge that we need to maintain our sovereignty as states, and that if there is, whether the events are beyond what we can handle on our own, it is only by our request and I think that is very important. Jessie spoke earlier in her intervention about consent. We are sovereign states, and I think the responsibility, what the international community needs to understand, when we request the support, when they come, they are here to support our system, not to overrun our system, but to support us. So it is really based on what our needs are and their ability to support what we say we need. So just to give an example, Beryl would have occurred, Melissa would have occurred. Melissa impacted Jamaica. Jamaica sent out a needs list. So it was not a case where we picked up whatever we thought they needed. We asked the question, and based on what they saw within their particular space, then they articulated their needs. So I think when we are contemplating the treaty and what it represents, I think it is important that we project what we want as countries and that our perspectives are respected. Same as on a smaller scale within communities, you know what your vulnerabilities are, you know what you require. And what we are doing as the state, as state agencies, we are in support of you and we respond to your needs. So when we get to the country level, we're hoping that that is the same. Now, as it relates to the second part of your question, in terms of the roles and duties of the state in the protection of people, the whole question of the protection of human rights is fundamental, and the states must ensure that human rights are upheld and respected during disasters. And we need to prioritize the dignity of persons, all persons. Whether you're disabled, we need to prioritize the dignity of women. We need to prioritize the dignity of our seniors. Because while we may be victims of disaster, that does not take away the fact that we are people first. The humanitarian principles, I think as states, we are expected to adhere to the humanitarian principles of neutrality and impartiality and what's not. And we have the right as states to seek assistance. Even if or when our national response capacities are exceeded. And I give the example of the SEDIMA Articles of Agreement. We practice it here in the regional space. If for whatever reason any one of the states are impacted, we have the right to request assistance from our various states. So for example, in 2021, St. Vincent and the Grenadines, they were impacted by a number of hazard events. And the way how our system is organized within the regional space, we have sub-regional focal points. The Barbados is the sub-regional lead for the central sub-region, which includes St. Vincent and the Grenadines, Dominica, and St. Lucia. and the way how the regional response mechanism operates. We support each other. We go to the sub-region first, but that does not negate the right of a country to have a bilateral arrangement with another country. But this is just how we are set up within the region. Similarly, Antigua, the Eastern Sub-Region Focal Point, they support the persons within, the countries within their area of remit. And it is important that we set up these structures so that there is some level of order within the chaos that a disaster may present. So the state also has a role in terms of cooperation and coordination. Our national emergency mechanism, which the Department of Emergency Management acts as a coordinator. We coordinate the various agencies, the various groups on the ground in terms of the community organizations and what's not, the non-governmental actors, the whole gambit, the private sector, the whole gambit. So it is our responsibility, I think, as a state to ensure that we have a coordination mechanism in place. And where we see gaps within our system, we have a right, and I think a responsibility and a duty of care to our population to ensure that we have cooperation mechanisms in place, the memorandums of understanding and what's not, so that if we are overwhelmed or if we need assistance, before the impact happens, we need to anticipate what are some of the asks, the assistance that we may require. And it is important that we ensure that those things are put in place. So for example, as we go into, I know we're in the hurricane season now, the Ministry of Agriculture, as well as the Private Sector Association, they usually spearhead and ensure that there are various MOUs in place to ensure that there's a greater amount of products, food products available to us throughout the season. Usually at least, at one point it was at least a 3-month buffer, just in case something happens or our supply chains are, for whatever reason, compromised. So the important takeaway is that there needs to be, the state needs to ensure that there are arrangements in place to support any response that is required. In addition to that, I think there is also a responsibility of the state to ensure that there is a public investment in disaster risk management across the board, not just in the response or the preparedness, but across the board. We must have a deliberate investment in terms of resources and what's not. We're signing all of these agreements. We're going to the international community, we're asking for assistance, but I think it is really important that as a country and as a government, we do ensure that there's a deliberate public investment in our governance infrastructure or the various organizations like the organization which I head. We have to have an investment in resources for persons to get the jobs done. There must be an investment in our community volunteers to ensure that they have the capacities to support that response and that preparedness effort when it occurs. And the whole question of responsibility for assistance. States have a responsibility, yes, to seek that assistance when the national capacity is overwhelmed. And we also have a responsibility as states to protect not only the relief personnel, but we have a responsibility to protect our first responders within the various agencies, our community volunteers on the ground. And we also have a responsibility to make sure that the adequate governance frameworks are in place. What does it mean? Before we sign on to any treaty, we need to understand the implications. What does that mean for resources within the National Disaster Office? What does that mean for the Barbados Fire Service? What does that mean for the various organizations, the district emergency organizations on the ground? So in terms of the roles and responsibilities of the state, it means that we may have to take a look at our local legislation, our local policies, our local programs to ensure that they are fit for purpose before we enter into any agreement at the global level.
Okay. Thank you so much, Ms. Hines. And I really like what you mentioned in terms of a duty of care to the population. That's so critical. So in the interest of time, we'll move quickly along to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, to Ms. Ben Griffith. And two questions I have for you. How should the state balance sovereignty with a duty to seek external assistance? And from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs perspective, is there a role for the IFRC in this treaty?
Okay, so I'll start with the first one. During the second regional roundtable on the draft articles of the protection of persons in the event of disasters, which was hosted in Jamaica in March this year, one of the main discussions that generated great debate was on sovereignty and balancing sovereignty with the state's duty to seek external assistance for its people during times of disaster. The question is posed here once again because there's an inherent tension between the two concepts that requires a delicate balance. To break it down, sovereignty refers to a state's independent authority to govern itself, i.e., its territory and its nationals, and make laws without external interference. The UN Charter at Article 2, Paragraph 1, is based on sovereign equality of all member states. Sovereignty regulates interstate relations and serves as a fundamental rule of sustained coexistence. In international law, it is predicated on the principle of non-interference, where sovereign states shall not interfere in each other's internal affairs. According to the United Nations for Disaster Risk Reduction, a disaster is a serious disruption of the functioning of a community or society involving human, material, economic, or environmental losses and impacts, which exceeds the capacity of the affected community or society to cope using its own resources. A disaster, by its very definition, disrupts a state's natural equilibrium. It does so by unsettling established assertions of competence and authority, thereby forcing a conflict between the state's ability to self-govern and protect its citizens from the hazards caused by the disaster, while simultaneously protecting its people and territory from dubious external assistance, which may or may not be altruistic or at least truly helpful in nature. Regrettably, it is not unheard of that countries have been exploited in the midst of disasters. Scholarly articles have reported that after Haiti's devastating earthquake in January 2010, Haiti was not trusted to govern itself, and external actors came in to assist. But in the end, most of the bilateral aid sent did not reach Haiti. So how do we balance sovereignty during disasters, especially where the state may be temporarily incapable of assisting its people? Here are a few suggestions. Article 10 of the draft articles of the PPED refers to the role of the affected state and its duty to ensure protection, and is framed in an attempt to achieve that elusive balance, which is to preserve sovereignty but ensure that humanitarian assistance is allowed or provided from external sources. The article could possibly be strengthened to be more explicit in its text. During the discussions in Jamaica, it was generally agreed that the language in the draft articles ought to emphasize and preserve the importance of state sovereignty throughout its framework. In addition, the consent of the affected state to receive external assistance, as well as ongoing diplomatic dialogue, were recommendations proffered as ways to maintain sovereignty and ensure that the people were given adequate assistance. Another way of achieving this balance is by ensuring that any external aid provided to the affected state never compromises local autonomy. In the Caribbean, for instance, the affected state remains in full control over disaster coordination, like through their local Department of Emergency Management and Red Cross Society. This mobilization is then supported by regional mechanisms like the Caribbean Disaster Emergency Management Agency, the IFRC, and the United Nations. Having experienced many disasters, the Caribbean region employs strategic planning beforehand through national policy and robust legislation. In addition, along with the deployment of local agencies and trusted regional agencies, this level of local autonomy supports sovereignty whilst receiving external assistance for the protection of people in the event of disasters. And in terms of a role for the IFRC, I'll just touch really on the history. It is true that the International Federation of the Red Cross and Red Crescent Societies provides humanitarian assistance in times of disaster, but many other equally reputable international organizations do so as well. It could be argued that the IFRC has managed to maintain its longevity in Barbados and throughout the world in around 191 states as a result of its adherence to neutrality and non-interference in the political and administrative governance of a country, whilst providing much needed relief to disaster-hit areas. The maintenance of this tenet of neutrality does not conflict with the sovereignty of states, usually allowing for the seamless transmission of humanitarian and disaster assistance. For the most part, states do not feel threatened, especially as they work in conjunction with their local Red Cross or Red Crescent societies. Having been established over 100 years ago, the IFRC is synonymous with humanitarian relief in times of disaster, thereby cementing its role as a trusted source of external assistance.
Thank you so much, Ms. Ben Griffith, for those really good examples of, how can we delicately balance sovereignty and this idea of seeking external assistance. So we'll move then now to Barbados Red Cross, so Ms. Alexander, and my two questions are, should there be a right to humanitarian assistance, and in what ways can the facilitation of external assistance be strengthened in the treaty?
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you very much, Ms. Jordan. So in short, we believe and recommend that the treaty should include a right to humanitarian assistance. Recognizing that right would not create a new obligation so much as confirm one that international law already implies. The right to human dignity has been mentioned several times already this afternoon. And when a hazard impacts a community, leaving people without food, water, shelter, or medical care, their most basic rights, the right to life and the right to dignity, are directly at stake. The UN General Assembly recognized as far back as 1988 that abandoning disaster victims without assistance threatens life and offends human dignity. And our own Red Cross, Red Crescent movement affirmed this right in 1993 and again in 1995 the second time at the international conference where states are represented. On the basis of that, the IFRC proposes that Draft Article 5 be amended to include the right to humanitarian assistance before, during, and after a disaster. Now, we understand that states may have concerns that such a right could be seen as creating a new or open-ended obligation. That concern is understandable, but we believe it can be answered. This is a right held by affected people. It does not require a state that can meet its own needs to ask for help, nor to accept help from every actor that offers. For small island states, asking for assistance is not a loss of sovereignty, but an exercise of it. It adds to the resources a government can draw on while the state decides whether help is needed, what kind, and from whom. Now, my colleague spoke about sovereignty and the humanitarian principles that guide this sovereignty, impartiality, and reaching those most at risk should shape all disaster risk management overall and not only its response. Now, on the second question, the facilitation of external assistance. We know from experience that in the hours and days after a hazard strikes, the volume of support rises sharply and coordination becomes rather complex. The lesson seen time and again is that the legal and financial facilities this support depends on, such as customs exemptions, tax relief, visas and work permits, recognition of qualifications, and the legal recognition of approved actors need to be in place long before a crisis and not improvised in the middle of one. Now, Draft Article 15 names the areas where facilitation is needed, but it does not say what a state should actually do or when. These facilities do two things. They speed up the surge support when a hazard strikes, but more importantly, when they are in place ahead of time and extend to the local actors, such as the national societies and other NGOs who support communities day to day. They let trusted actors invest steadily in community preparedness rather than mobilizing only once a crisis has begun. We've heard time and time again today how important it is to have preparedness measures in place, and how the level of preparedness can really impact or mitigate the level of impact that a disaster has on a local community. So sovereignty is protected throughout, and the facilities should apply only to actors the state has requested or accepted. And it remains for the state to let the standards for assistance it will accept benchmarks such as the sphere standards so that it accepts what is most genuinely needed and turns away what they do not. And these facilities do identify ahead of time the quality of the assistance, as was mentioned previously, such as housing quality, which was mentioned in one of the earlier sessions. We know the importance of preparedness to mitigate the impact of disasters. So those facilitations really should begin long before any formal declaration and should reach the transit states or assistance passes through. Now, when the assistance ends, it should end through consultation. Once needs have been met for aid withdrawn abruptly can flood a local market and undercut the very needs communities depend on to recover. So in closing, this treaty is a chance to give humanitarian assistance the certainty of law rather than leaving it to goodwill. For a region in the front line of the climate crisis, that certainty may decide whether help arrives in time or whether it doesn't. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ms. Alexander. And I like what you said when you mentioned the facilitation and the legal facilities allows for trusted actors to invest steadily in preparedness. and I like how that's framed. It sums it up well. So we'll move on to our final panelist, Ms. Eiffel, who is the National Human Rights Commissioner. And my two questions to her are, what role should the National Human Rights Commissioner play in the protection of the human rights of persons in the event of disasters? And secondly, in what ways can the articles on human rights and human dignity be strengthened?
Good afternoon, everyone. Wait, thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. Good. So, thank you for inviting me to be part of this panel. Sometimes people think that disasters and human rights do not coexist, but they do. Disasters do not suspend human rights. In fact, it is precisely when systems are under the greatest pressure that human rights safeguards become most important. I want you to hold on to that and digest it. A national human rights institution, such as the National Human Rights Commission, our role is simple. It is not to direct the operational response to a disaster. That's not our bailiwick. That's not our raison d'etre. That's not why we're here. Because that responsibility rests on the designated disaster management, emergency response authorities. But the NHRI, or rather in this context, the Commission, our role is to provide independent human rights oversight and to help ensure that disaster preparedness, response, and recovery remain centered on people, because it is the people that suffer. We can rebuild the buildings. We can find jobs, hopefully. Aid will come, food will be provided, but if it doesn't reach the people, and if the people are not given their dignity and their opportunities for autonomy and to discuss and to participate, then that is where we have failed. And that is why human rights context is important in protecting people. I see that role as having 5 main dimensions. First, in prevention and preparedness. So, the Commission should review disaster laws or policies or shelter arrangements, evacuation procedures, and public information systems. And that should be looked at through a human rights lens. How are these messages being taken across? How are the people being included in the discussions? How are we working together? And this includes asking whether persons with disabilities, older persons, children, migrants, persons experiencing homelessness, institutionalized persons, and other at-risk groups, can they access warnings? Can they access transportation, shelters, healthcare, and relief services on an equal basis? If you look at human rights treaties, the statement, the phrase, equal basis, permeates all of them. So second dimension is this: advice and standard setting. The Commission can advise the government and emergency management authorities on incorporating equality, non-discrimination, accessibility, reasonable accommodation, privacy, personal autonomy, and meaningful community participation into disaster plans and operating procedures. During the Japanese tsunami of some years ago, there was an overwhelming response. But some of the sad things we saw at that time were things where some persons, they built homes for people to be able to be moved out of the shelters. And they built a housing structure with 4 stories, no elevators, and put an elderly mother and her wheelchair-using daughter in a 3rd-floor apartment, which meant that the elderly lady couldn't lift her daughter downstairs, so her daughter became a prisoner. That is why the advice of the Human Rights Commission, of any human rights institution, can assist in helping you to look at some of these things. And in the 3rd dimension, monitoring. During a disaster, the Commission should be able to monitor whether assistance is being provided fairly and without discrimination, whether shelters are safe and accessible, whether people have access to food, to water, sanitation, medication, and information, and whether emergency powers or restrictions are lawful, necessary, proportionate, and time-limited. Again, back to this scenario in Japan, it was almost 18 months before the authorities saw it fit to remove that elderly mother and her daughter to an accessible home. 4th dimension, accountability and redress. There must be accessible ways for affected persons to report discrimination, exclusion, exploitation, or other rights violations. If the messages come across the television screens and they have no closed captioning, how can a deaf person know? If websites are designed that persons who have dyslexia or persons who have challenges manipulating things like that cannot access them, then they have no way to redress. If persons who have language barriers have no means by which to report the difficulties that they find themselves in, then where is the redress? Where is the accountability? The Commission should also be able to receive or review complaints, identify systemic failings, make recommendations, and follow up on corrective action. And the 5th dimension, recovery and reconstruction. Human rights protection cannot end when the immediate emergency passes. During the Haitian earthquake, many persons with disabilities who lived there, many persons experiencing homelessness, had one ray of hope that now that the entire city needed to be reconstructed, that their needs would be taken into account. Recovery programs should not reproduce the inequalities that existed before the disaster. If you're rebuilding a building, why build it again without a ramp? If you are reconstructing your staff, why not make sure that you include persons that can interpret, that can communicate with others? The Commission should therefore monitor access to housing, to social protection, to education, to health care, to livelihoods, and reconstruction assistance. And now this brings me to the second question, which are the proposed articles on human dignity and human rights. Draft Article 4, I believe it is, states that the inherent dignity of the human person must be respected and protected, while Draft Article 5 recognizes that persons affected by disasters are entitled to respect and the protection of their human rights. Now, these are all important foundations, but they are very broadly expressed. The international right. So we would like to say that we should be confirming protections are intended to extend beyond immediate disaster response. But the treaty itself should not say, it doesn't say that clearly. So I would like to recommend strengthening the articles in the following ways. First, that the treaty should expressly protect human rights and dignity before, during, and after disasters. This would cover disaster risk reduction, preparedness, emergency response, recovery, and reconstruction. Second, it should refer to all human rights, including the right to humanitarian assistance, without creating the impression that only certain rights apply during disasters. Third, the treaty should include an explicit guarantee of equality and non-discrimination. It should require accessibility and resilience accommodation for persons with disabilities and recognize that some persons may be disproportionately affected because of pre-existing barriers and inequalities. And fourth, dignity should be made operational. It should encompass personal autonomy, privacy, safety, family unity, culturally appropriate assistance, and respect in the treatment of displaced persons, people living in shelters, and persons who are injured, missing, or deceased. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ms. Eiffel, for giving that very comprehensive breakdown of what it takes to strengthen human rights and human dignity and to protect those rights. So in the interest of time, I know we are at that hour where we all want to, run away. So I would do something simultaneously. I would invite you to please take a moment to answer this one question, because this is a consultation indeed. We want to be able to hear from you, and we want to know, based on what you've heard over the past almost two hours already, what elements should the proposed treaty on the protection of persons in the event of disasters have? And whilst you take your phones and scan the QR code and just answer that one question for us, I'd also like to invite, if anyone in the audience would like to take the floor with any comments based on what you've heard so far. And also, you know, to bear in mind this general question of how do you think that the treaty can change the future of disaster risk management in Barbados? You know, if this treaty is adopted, what would it mean for Barbados? What would it mean for local authorities, local actors? And, you know, what would it mean for coordination between the international and the local actors? So I'll stop here. And if anyone would like to take the floor, you can do so. Yes. We have someone. We have a mic.
Thank you. Very briefly, I'm Hallam Hope, and I was caught by the point that Carrie had made about the need for, you know, familiar need for investment and resources. That you all hear about that. We heard that the demands are increasing and the funds are reducing, that sort of thing. But Carrie, could I ask, in the context of Article 9, when we talk about mitigation and preparedness for disasters and that sort of thing, are we applying innovation in modern financial thinking to the youth to create new jobs and careers, new areas of education and knowledge investment, to create a higher degree of financial independence as far as not only at both the individual level, at the level of the young people, but also in terms of the institutional levels? So does what I'm suggesting that, you know, might not necessarily be doing that, does that area question about expanding the competence of young people in the area of investment and technology and financing, does that relate, you think, to Article 9? Yeah, that's my question.
What I will say to you in response to that is, including our youth, expanding our financial literacy, our independence, our innovative thinking and tools is essential at every level. It doesn't matter which article. It needs to be a part of our, if we're talking about mitigation, if we're talking about planning, if we're talking about those things, we need to take a lot more into consideration. And not just for the youth, but for many persons, because it will take innovation in a lot of ways to redress a lot of these situations.
I also want Carrie to actually
The other Kerry.
Yes, there are two Kerrys.
Just to add to what the other Kerry just indicated, the importance of including the voices of everyone that can be potentially affected by disasters is very important. And we have made a concerted effort at the national level to bring the various players to the table, including the youth. It is reflected in terms of our National Comprehensive Disaster Management Policy, our early warning policies. We bring people to the table. The youth I know usually people would say they are the future, but you have to look at it, they're now. We have to plan now, and we have to include their voices and their needs. There must be a continued, and I think an increased effort or investment in the youth across the board. We have at the Department of Emergency Management, we have an internship program. And for the last 3 to 4 years, what we have seen is there is a need out there, there's a demand. There's a demand to, one, understand disaster risk management and contribute to it. There is a demand by the youth. They want to learn certain skills. So we create that opportunity, and SEDEMA does have a similar program, a young professional program. UWI, they also have various programs as well. And what we have done within our internship program, we have incorporated the assistance of my friend, the Chief Fire Officer, the Barbados Met Service, and what's not, to participate in that. Because there is that demand. Sometimes it is a case of awareness. A lot of the young adults that come through the doors at Department of Emergency Management, they will tell you they didn't even know what it meant. They're part of a program at UE that says they have to come and do 50 hours or 150 hours. But what I've seen over the past 3 to 4 years, they've come. I don't even have to ask them now, and they're spreading the word to a point where we have some of the young people you saw in and out of the room. They have come back to the department, and they will tell you, they don't even realize that the 150 hours are up. They just come and they want to participate. They want to understand. And what they have done, and I'm happy that they will showcase some of their work tomorrow, in tomorrow's session, they've been able to come and critique what we have. And sometimes they tell us, look, while yes, it may resonate with a particular section of the population, they will tell you it will not resonate with us. So for us, we have to listen to what they're saying and see how best we can implement, because at the end of the day, it is about building that level of awareness, improving what we have, improving that public investment that we have in the disaster risk management, and they have to be a part of that solution. They are ready and they're willing. I find that they're very innovative, and when it comes to especially the technology aspect, they know more about technology than anybody over 30. I'm very sorry. When it comes to social media and what's not, the young people are it. It is important that we continue to include them and give them the skills to go there and lead and influence their particular spheres. So yes, I would say we have to ensure that we need to expand their competencies, and it's important that we offer these platforms, whether it is the National Training Initiative or what's not, but we need to speak with them to also understand what are their needs as young persons, because they look at the world in a different way to us.
Okay, thanks so much, Ms. Hines. I believe we have two persons, my colleague to the front and also Mr. James, you had your hand up, so we'll start at the front.
Melanie Shoy, Social Empowerment Agency. My question is concerned less with the macro level states or even what the document described as competent actors, but there may be one-off community groups who want to assist in the event of a disaster in a fellow Caribbean country, a church group, one-off and spontaneous. I am not aware of what current mechanisms would facilitate their gathering a barrel and wanting to send it off to the other impacted country, but how would a treaty encourage or discourage such spontaneous acts of goodwill, as was mentioned before, or would it discourage it, you know? And the second part would speak to governance. Is there any recourse, or rather, I'm thinking the treaty needs to look at what would happen if the points of the treaty is not adhered to.
Okay, is that question directed to any panelist or to me? I can share my views and maybe invite anyone on the panel as well. So you spoke about church groups or small community groups that might want to, spontaneously support. I believe that the treaty should not necessarily discourage those acts of goodwill, but make it more, I would say, targeted and direct and aligned. Because what we risk have happening where you have a lot of spontaneous groups, doing, philanthropic acts without specific guidelines can cause a disaster within a disaster, if you know what I mean, where you have, unsolicited goods and so on. So I believe that the treaty would support countries developing very clear guidelines on what should be donated, what quality is required, because we don't want people, when you speak about human rights and human dignity, it's also reflected in the quality of assistance that's provided. We don't want persons donating things that are just inventory from their cupboards, that this has to be, done with thought and based on the needs. And Kerry mentioned, it's very important to, when we speak about consent and what are the needs that are being identified and requested. So I'll just leave it right there and invite any of the other panelists to comment.
Just a comment in terms of, I do agree with Ms. Jordan in terms of her intervention about clear guidelines. Because at the end of the day, we need to maintain certain standards, because that in itself is a protection mechanism for the people who we are supposedly serving. Whether you are the DO rendering some level of assistance, or you are the victim of an impact. We need to preserve certain standards and to ensure that you get the best while in a disaster situation. Now, in terms of your second intervention about monitoring of the system, in any system, I think there needs to be a built-in monitoring and evaluation and reporting system, because we need to understand if what we have put in place is actually working, is actually serving the population. If it isn't, we have the opportunity to tweak it, reassess, maybe throw it out the window and rebuild. But the idea is that you have a system that is fit for purpose and it can pick up when there are any issues, when we have any challenges, and it can also identify the strengths of the system, because those strengths become good or best practices, not only for us as the sovereign state, but for other actors within the overarching global system. So in any system, there must be monitoring, evaluation, and reporting. That is how we can continuously make the system better and fit for purpose.
Thank you so much, Ms. Hines, and we'll move to Mr. James.
Thank you very much. I listened to the discussions, and I'm trying to get over what I'm seeing in Article 11 and 12. Specifically, it says, to the extent that a disaster manifestly exceeds its national response capacity, the affected state has the duty to seek assistance from, as appropriate, other states, the United Nations, and other potential assisting actors. And then in 12, it goes on to talk about Office of External Assistance. And I'm just thinking here, we're deliberating on this here, but then we have an example of something counterproductive happening within our region. What happens when a state is going through a disaster situation that is caused by the actions of another state that has significant influence in the region in which it resides? And what is the supporting action of the UN then? Is there going to be a third arbitrary party that is going to assist with the delivery of the goods to the states? And we have examples of our brothers in the north, what they're going through right now with the actions of our other persons in the north. And so I am trying to wrap around in my mind as to how would this now address a situation like that, in terms of when a state is clearly being put in a state of distress, it's in a disastrous situation as it is due to the actions of another state. However, if we're relying on the UN system to provide a solution or at least act as a mediator, how then does the situation get rectified when we're seeing what is playing out now based on, like we said, the global shifting socioeconomic and political prowess that we. So I'm still trying, I'm fighting with it right now on my mental scape. So I don't know if any thoughts from any members of the panel or yourself on how do we now look at a situation like that that is unfolding in front of our eyes and then justify this document saying what it's saying here, that other states have the right to seek the United Nations for potential assistance. So on paper we're saying this, but in practice we're seeing that the system is unable to function as we would like. That's where I am in terms of the quandary I'm at.
So, Mr. James, you've asked quite a complex question. You know, in terms of, I'm not sure if you might be referring to some of the geopolitics in the region, and I think that would definitely be a question of debate at the UN level in terms of how do we balance, you know, the rights of states in terms of their sovereignty, you know, and the sovereignty goes both ways. Sovereignty also to protect the persons as well within their jurisdiction. I don't know if the persons in the permanent mission are still online, and if they may have also comments to weigh in, and if they,
Yes. Sorry, we're still online. Hi, just to respond to that question. So essentially, what is happening with this treaty is one of the first things that was put in the treaty is the definition of disaster. What you are speaking of is a very real reality, but that falls into a different category of negotiation and discussion. So if you remember, firstly, my colleague, Mr. Cox, gives his apologies for being absent, but he specifically mentioned that at this current time, there is another treaty ongoing, which is crimes against humanity. These discussions are happening within the Security Council. So when there is aggression state to state, or when these things fall within the realm of international humanitarian law, which is when you're dealing with armed conflict, those do not fall under the scope of the PPED treaty. This treaty is dealing with things that are not due to armed conflict or due to, I would say, aggression by other states. This is specifically dealing with what we may say are natural disasters, but even things that may be man-made but not due to armed conflict. So there are a lot of layers to this, and the elements pointed out by the other members of the panel about sovereignty and dealing with those geopolitical tensions are relevant. However, in the room, that's why it was very important. And some countries in their textual proposals specifically put want to put that this treaty does not deal with armed conflict situations. And that's also why I think in section, let me tell you now, I think there's a clause at the end, Article 18, that says the present draft articles do not apply to the extent that the response to a disaster is governed by the rules of international humanitarian law. So the context which you are speaking of would fall under that humanitarian law sector, and that has its own rules, that has its own structure already. But what is very absent in the international space are frameworks and treaties to deal with natural disaster type of situations, which is what the PPED is seeking to address.
Okay, well then several things. One, the definition in this has to change because it speaks to a disaster means a calamitous event or series of events resulting in widespread loss of human life, great human suffering and distress, mass displacement, or large-scale material and environmental damage. That's the first thing, so the definition probably needs some work. Two, in terms of the disaster management community, we don't really say natural disasters because there's no such thing.
Yes.
You have natural hazards that promulgate, and the disaster is the situation resulting.
Yes.
So when we're looking at whether it's armed conflict or a social issue, etc., and so on, the resultant situation is what we're looking at as the disaster. So in terms of that, then we now have to look at that definition and how that plugs in with international law concerning that, because then you have a dichotomy there. In other words, you have a situation of clear suffering, etc., and so on, which is the definition of a disaster, immaterial of what caused it, whether it be a natural hazard, implementation, social distress, celestial impact by an asteroid, it doesn't matter, and everything. So that's the issue there with that has that whole connotation. And the next point is in terms of when we talk about humanitarian law and suffering, etc., and so on, when we begin to separate and categorize it based on what the cause was, we start ignoring that it's still the same situation they're in. They're in suffering, etc., and so on. Immaterial of what was the cause, what is going to be the response of the humanitarian network to the people's suffering, regardless of whether it was caused by a disease, whether it was caused by a war, whether it was caused by the threat of a war, even if a single shot wasn't fired, whether it was caused by tectonic plates, earthquakes, tsunami, doesn't matter, and so on. So I think that is now, we get into the weeds when we start to split hairs. So I think that's another aspect that has to be looked at, just in my opinion. I'm sorry, my humble, foolish opinion. Take it for what it's worth, but yeah. All right, Carrie, I'll get back to you.
Well, I was just going to respond before I go off, but I understand what you are saying completely, and fortunately, I am aware of, that we don't have natural disasters. That was definitely drilled into me at CERMES. So my tutors would be very embarrassed, but I did not know how else to describe what they were trying to capture. What I will say is that here at the United Nations, the framework for humanitarian law is actually extremely well developed. It is because if you think about the origins of the United Nations, it was mostly built out of World War II. So we've had decades, I believe, of testing and developing the rules and laws when it comes to state-to-state aggression, humanitarian issues, armed conflict, etc. That was what birthed the entity. What it does not have great, I would say, material on is actually what the PPED is trying to cover. So you cannot apply humanitarian law to environmental disasters. And you can't take those rules and apply them here. So that's why it's very important to develop these frameworks, especially now given this current context where these types of disasters are becoming more common. The Sendai framework was a good leap into the right direction. But again, as was said by Ms. Jordan, that is voluntary and non-binding. So this area in particular needs development. And I wouldn't, advise combining them, because one of these things creates a lot of sensitive geopolitical situations, and the other one is something that for the most part countries understand the importance and the need, which is more of, but it's becoming increasingly political as we go through with climate change and all of the other risks associated with all of that. So combining them might not be a good idea, but that is not for me to decide. However, what I will say is that this section, this area of disaster law is severely underdeveloped here at the United Nations, and it's very important that this treaty is developed, even if, there may be tensions regarding how other areas of law are being followed or not being followed by member states. So I do hope that clarifies.
Thank you so much, Ms. Hines, for providing a little bit more clarity. We do have a question or comment to the back, I believe.
Yeah, good evening. Article 1, I realize, is the smallest of the articles. It couldn't help but watch and admire Ms. Eiffel while she interpreted from her device. I also endorse a lot of comments that she made, because I believe strongly that in Barbados, there's not enough provision made for the disabled community. A disabled person, well, disability doesn't mean inability. A disabled person might not be on the ground, but that doesn't necessarily mean that the information captured cannot be had or done by that person. So I think that even in building back, if there's a natural disaster, certain aspects of like a ramp and other aids should be encapsulated into that product. But I think that we need, I know that we need to be more inclusive in Barbados as it relates to the disability community.
Thank you so much for that very important comment in terms of, how do we capture those provisions, particularly on disability. Are there any other comments or questions? I know it's at the hour where, the energy is down. I would remind you, if you haven't as yet, please do fill out the survey, the QR code, just to have your feedback captured. And what we will be doing from IFRC side is that we will be documenting, all of the comments, the interventions. We will be compiling that and submitting it to the Barbados Ministry of Foreign Affairs, who would take it back to their own processes. I'll let Ms. Ben Griffith speak to that.
Yes, so once we get the compiled document from Ms. Jordan, it then has to go to the attention of our minister and to the cabinet. And once that's approved, then we can share it with our mission, and then they will share it with the sixth committee dealing with the protection of persons in the event of disaster.
Great, thank you so much, Ms. Ben Griffith. I don't see any more hands or any further comments, but I would just want to express my deep gratitude to all of you for sticking with me for the additional time. I know many of us are like me, we get hungry. So I do appreciate you spending the time with us. And I'll just, if there's any lasting comments from our panel before we close. Any final comments?
Just to say thank you as well to everyone who has been a part of the process thus far. Thank you for your comments and your insights, your questions. And needless to say, we are at the Department of Emergency Management, and I hope that will extend to the other agencies and organizations as well that are here in the room. We are really committed to the process, to work through the process, because at the end of the day, this treaty is important to us, and I think it is important for us to ensure that we comment. Too often I've been in international forums where the Caribbean is very poorly represented. So we need to ensure that our voices are heard. When these treaties and these various instruments are negotiated, we need to have our voices heard. So I think today was one step in that process, and I hope it will continue, not just here in Barbados, but across the region. Because as we know, when we meet in international forums, it is really, there's strength in unity. And when we go as small island states or as a region, our voices resonate a bit more than when you have one lone wolf in the wilderness.
Okay, thank you again so much, Ms. Hines, for those really inspiring words and challenge to all of us. And so I would leave it here. I would just express my gratitude also, of course, to all our panelists and to the mission who connected online. Thanks to both of you for your really insightful contributions. So thank you again, and thank you for your attention.
Okay, good evening, everyone, and thanks so much to the panel and presenters on the protection of, on the treaty on protection of persons in the event of disasters. My name is Tamara Lovell. I am the Community Resilience Specialist with SEDEMA, and I have the responsibility of closing out and doing a recap. So I'm standing between all of the discussion that you heard today and and the celebrations that we have planned in terms of the launch of the Community Resilience Award. But as we bring today's proceedings to a close, I really wanted to thank each of you for your active participation and for the rich exchange of ideas that have actually taken place throughout today's sessions. The discussions have really enforced a central message, one that community resilience is no longer simply about recovering from disasters. We've heard that from the very first speaker. It is about anticipating risk, adapting to change, and ensuring that our communities, economies, and institutions can continue to thrive despite disruption. The disruption will come, it happens, but that they can continue to thrive. Our keynote challenged us to rethink what community resilience actually means for today's Caribbean. And throughout the day, that conversation continued to evolve. We heard that resilience cannot be the responsibility of disaster management agencies alone. It requires a whole of society approach that brings together governments, communities, civil society, academia, development partners, and the private sector around a shared vision and, importantly, shared action. Several themes emerged across the discussions. We explored the need to shift from response to anticipation through adaptive social protection and anticipatory action, the importance of strengthening livelihoods, food security, and resilient businesses. We heard about the role of technology and innovation and the need for stronger partnerships, sustainable financing, and effective governance to ensure that resilience actually becomes an integral part of national development rather than something that we think about only after disaster strikes. There was also considerable discussion on the importance of economic resilience. Presenters throughout the day and speakers highlighted the need to improve access to affordable insurance and risk financing solutions, grants, and other financial mechanisms that enable businesses, community organizations, and civil society to prepare for, withstand, and recover more quickly from disasters. Equally important was the recognition that more needs to be done in terms of business continuity planning for that to become standard practice rather than an exception. The discussions today also reinforced the message that builds directly on last year's conference. As I sat and I listened, many of the discussions were around also inclusivity, so recognizing that resilient communities are also inclusive communities. Last year, we focused on integrating youth and persons with disabilities into national resilience efforts. And today we've actually gone a step further, recognizing that resilience is strongest, not just when these groups are simply included, but when they're also empowered as partners and leaders in shaping more resilient communities. This afternoon's consultation on the proposed treaty reminded us that resilience is ultimately about protecting people, their dignity, their rights, and their well-being. So as we reflect on today's discussions, I encourage us to carry this momentum into tomorrow. Today, we had the privilege of listening and hearing from the outstanding lineup of speakers and panelists who challenged our thinking and shared valuable experiences. Tomorrow, however, the conversation becomes yours. So we look forward tomorrow to hearing your perspectives, your experiences, your innovations, and even the challenges you face in your own countries and communities. The collective knowledge and experience that we have in this room is one of our greatest strengths, and it is through learning from one another that we will be able to advance community resilience across our Caribbean. And finally, if there's one takeaway from today, that I certainly got is that resilience is not a destination. It is a journey. It is a journey that requires continuous learning, collaboration, innovation, and above all, shared responsibility. So together, let's continue that journey towards a Caribbean where no one is left behind and every community is actually better prepared for the challenges of tomorrow. So thank you once again for your thoughtful engagement and your valuable contributions throughout the day. I am now going to hand over to Mr. Brooks, who will provide the next announcements and guide us into this evening's program. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tamara. I won't keep you very much longer, but first we need to have the presentations of tokens to our distinguished panel. So if the presenters can make their way. Let us first make our presentation to the most honorable We at the DEM believes that when persons of our distinguished panel who have taken the time not only to be here with us, but to share their expertise and information, and I think we all can say that the presentations thus far has been very beneficial and very informative. Let's give them all a round of applause. We just about come to the end of today's conference proceedings. Your program has indicated the launch of a Community Resilience Award. This, I will not read the criteria and the eligibility and the other information to it. I urge you to do that on your own. But this afternoon, we would like to use this occasion to officially launch the Community Resilience Award program. This special event celebrates and recognizes the outstanding efforts of individuals and organizations and communities that have demonstrated excellence and innovation in building resilience across Barbados and the wider Caribbean. And you would have noticed from the eligibility and the criteria and the process of submitting your respective reports and the judging process, it means that you will have the opportunity from now, and based on your registration, and you have indicated your willingness to participate, to vie for this coveted award, we leave that entirely up to you. But during the course of tomorrow and the last day, especially in the closing of the conference, you will get more detailed information. This launch is going to encompass the complement of a cultural presentation, which forms a small part of a cocktail session, and everything has already been provided on the stage in the upper foyer, just as we are coming in. So all it leaves for me, ladies and gentlemen, is to thank you very much for sharing the days. It has been a long day, but when you have this type of information, you can compact it into an hour or two. And I sincerely hope that what we have learned and what we have shared and the whole camaraderie, that the launch of this Community Resilience Award gives us another opportunity to mingle. Because one thing we talk about building resilience, it starts at the community level. And at the community level, we urge each of you to get to know each other, mingle, and that sets the stage for another exciting day tomorrow, which you can see in your programs. So, Madam Director, I would like to thank you and the esteemed panel. Madam Carrie-Ann Eiffel, if you could forgive me for saying Madam, because I know Ms. Eiffel for quite a while. And sometimes you need to drop off the formalities. Hello? She says I can call her Carrie. And we also have Ms. Alexandra, and I keep forgetting your name, Madam. Joanne. So ladies and gentlemen, let us make our way up to the foyer, and the cultural presentation is expected to start as soon as the first person gets on the landing. So thank you very much, and we look forward to seeing you tomorrow.